Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Welcome to our special Sally Miller Gerhardt tribute program. Sally passed away this year, July 14th. In 1973, Sally was, I think, the first out lesbian to obtain a tenure-track position at San Francisco State University, where she established one of the country's very first women's and gender studies program. So in her long life, Sally was a science fiction writer, an educator, teacher, a feminist, a friend, an amazing community member, and a political activist. So we're all here today to share tribute to Sally. Our speakers today are also friends, activists, artists, filmmakers, community members, and giant voices themselves. And so they're also all here to share tribute to Sally. So welcome all of our speakers. Thanks so much for joining us and being a part of this amazing program. I'll have each of you introduce yourselves and then share, one of your fondest memories, whether it was meeting Sally in person or a true fact or something you've uncovered, but do share with us. And so we'll start with Jorg.
My name is Jorg Fokkerly. I am the co-producer, one of the co-producers on the film. Deborah and I have known each other for, I think, 11 or 12 years. I think of everybody on this panel, I'm probably the one who had the least encounters with Sally. And I think the first time I met her was actually 2 years ago when we had a shoot in Willits and I was replacing a camera person. But I think one of my favorite memories of Sally is actually before the film even got made. Deborah made a beautiful short film, a 30-minute short film about lesbians and aging. And Sally is one of the women portrayed in the film, one of, I can't remember how many, 7 or 8 women. And just seeing her as part of a short film, I completely fell in love with her. Her energy, her personality, her sense of humor, her ferocity. I mean, she was just amazing. And I remember watching that film and thinking, I want to know more about that particular woman. And I'm glad that eventually we ended up talking about making a feature about Sally.
We actually do have a trailer of the film that you're talking about, the short, or the film in progress, but why don't we finish off our introductions, then we'll play the trailer.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Okay, my name's Deborah Craig, and I, as Jorg said, I was making a short film about lesbians and aging, and I heard from somebody that she knew an octogenarian living on women's land and still cutting her own firewood with a chainsaw, and I'm like, I want to meet this woman. And so I went up, and only gradually did I figure out this is the Sally Gerhardt, and she was already in her early 80s, and just right from the get-go, it was an adventure. We started calling it the lesbian safari because we all piled, me and my camera woman, piled in Sally's car. Sally was in the front seat. Her dog was in the passenger seat, which was covered with dog hair. There was nothing in the back, so we were kind of rattling around in the back and thought we might fall out, but we survived. It was just excitement from the get-go. And again, the more I learned about her, the more I realized her importance, that her story really needed to be told.
That's so wonderful. Melanie.
Hi, thank you so much for doing this to Michelle and the Commonwealth Club. My name is Melanie Nathan. My pronouns are she and her. And I met Sally back around 2013, 2014. I can't recall exactly when. And I knew who she was. She had worked on the Briggs Initiative as a fiery activist. And when I met her, I felt like I was meeting the god of feminism and lesbian exposure, only to find out, and I hope we can talk more about this, that she was upset at the time due into an erasure of herself, but I hope we can talk more about that. When you bring Sally to mind, you just smile because she was so profoundly fun. If there was any way to remember Sally, it would be the word fun, which really, stood in tandem with everything serious that she ever did. So just a really big thank you to you for giving her this tribute, and to the filmmakers for doing something that is so critical for all of us lesbians and community in general, for women, to really tell the world who Sally is and what she did for all of us.
Thank you, Melanie. And Ondine.
My name is Ondine Rary. I'm the editor and one of the co-producers of the film. And I only met Sally twice, but it's funny, like York, my most visceral memory is of meeting her on my video monitor. And I wasn't given any sort of an introduction to her as a person. She was just one of 8 people, and she just sort of leapt off the screen, somehow transforming me a little bit in the process. But so I Googled her, and immediately it was like, oh my God, wow. We look at all the things that this person has done. And so that was the beginning of my Sally Gerhardt journey, which has just gotten, I don't know, better and richer as it has gone along.
Thank you. Well, let's take a look at that trailer now and get to see some glimpses of Sally.
I'm sorry. I just caught our camera woman and she's smiling. It's fun having her behind the camera. Have you noticed that? Okay,
yeah, absolutely.
Good. Oh, she's on her knees. God, I haven't had a woman on her knees for me for a long time.
This is Sally Gerhardt.
And would you like for me to hold the camera for you?
She is a force of nature.
Here come the lesbians. Here come the leaping lesbians.
There are those people apparently who question the health and the beauty and the naturalness and the strength of same-sex relationships. And all I've got to say is I wish they were here today.
She reminded me of Maya Angelou, the way she would just wrap you into her words.
The woman just exuded charisma. Everything about her was as glamorous as a radical lesbian could be,
She just had it, and we all fell in love with her.
It was such an exciting time, the 70s and this feminist burst. There was the big word patriarchy.
It was before women's studies really had started anywhere.
And here was this powerful woman, Sally, who gave women great powers in her writing and in her thinking.
She also really wanted women-only space. A lot of us did.
Women's land, right? And so I came to California with the dream of having land like that.
Are you a lesbian separatist?
Radical, lesbian, feminist, separatist, italicized.
Yeah.
In a classic case of life imitating art, Sally co-founded a women's land community at the same time that she was writing a futuristic sci-fi novel that became a cult hit called The Wonderground.
Had a friend come from the East Coast searching for Sally Gerhardt of The Wonderground. Well, the book is a fantasy about women with all kinds of psychic powers living on the land and flying and teleportation, the whole works.
Sally was way ahead of her time in connecting the dots.
She's a visionary.
She helped change history. I think she was seen by a lot of people as a major spokesperson for the gay community.
Overwhelmingly, it is true that it's the heterosexual men, I might add, who are the child molesters.
I believe that's a myth. I've never seen
senators, the FBI, the National Council on Family Relations, the Santa Clara County Child Sexual Abuse Treatment Center, and on and on and on.
Sally Gerhardt, at a particular moment in our history, when it really mattered, she stepped up and she inspired tens of thousands of people, articulated the dreams of millions. She's an extraordinary woman.
By now, I found myself wondering, why haven't I ever heard about Sally Gerhardt?
Here we go, girls.
My attempt to find out.
Hold on to each other's hands. We are encouraging relationships among women.
Turned out to be a pretty wild ride.
Sorry about that, girls. We're going to be okay. Deborah Craig, she was handed a puzzle, and it was up to her to untangle it.
Wow. Wish we could see the whole thing now. You know, in each of the voices that had appeared in the trailer, and these giant voices, you know, like a Gwen Craig, Cleve Jones, you all can hear in their voices when they're talking about Sally, how much Sally meant to them, but also they recognize how much Sally meant to her community, our community. Why don't we start talking about what Sally meant to us, and in a way in which to piece together the importance of continuing her legacy. I think Melanie had said it earlier, wanting to talk a little bit more about, you know, erasure of our community members, and I think there's something there, but we'll begin with Deborah.
Sally, I mean, Sally means a lot and a lot of different things, I think. And so the more that we delve into Sally, the more that we discover the complexity and the nuance and the multifaceted quality of Sally. I mean, I think what we've discovered ourselves, me and Jorg and Ondine, and what we're also thinking about for the film is we need to celebrate Sally's accomplishments. There are so many of them. There, as Melanie said, the first out lesbian to get granted tenure, one of the co-founders of one of the first women's studies program, a really integral piece of defeating the Briggs Initiative, and that was a huge, huge victory. An author in fields from communication to women's studies to religion. And so all of those accomplishments, I think, need to be recognized. But the more we get to know Sally, the more we realize that she was, as she said in her own words, I think it was her good friend, Morgaine, who told me, Sally used to tell people, I live in Northern California on a mountain of contradictions. So she was not only very funny, but very self-aware and sort of sometimes self-deprecating, or had that humor about herself. So she was a lesbian separatist, and we talked to folks who talk about how important that was, that she was sort of a beacon for that, and a strong voice for the need of women and lesbians to separate themselves out, to come into their own, at least at a certain period of time. And she also needed her solitude, and sometimes would find ways. In fact, in some ways we think maybe moving up to Willits was her way to find her solitude. And she was an incredibly powerful advocate for lesbians and women, and a separatist again in some ways. And then she really loved everybody. We interviewed a good old friend of hers who said Sally couldn't be separate from anybody. She just couldn't, she didn't want to be separate. Anybody she saw, she really wanted to embrace them and was curious about them and was interested in their humanity. And so she always had men friends, some of them gay, some of them straight. She had I was very, very pleased to be able to interview a good friend of hers up in Willits, who's a staunch Republican. And we went to her house, and she had a signed picture of Ronald Reagan up on up on her wall, and we're like, "Ooh, are we okay in here?" And she just loved Sally and was charmed by Sally and engaged with Sally. So I think all of those things, we need to celebrate her accomplishments and her complexity and her contradictions and her humanity.
Jorg.
Let me see, there's so much we could say in this context. I think first and foremost, I've always felt that I don't need to be part of a specific group or demographic to want to hear their stories told or hear their voices, and whether that's, right now we see this, like all these amazing films by filmmakers of color, like that are finally in Hollywood all over the place, whether it's, the Shang-Chi or, Wakanda, that we see films being made by people that we haven't heard before. And I think to some degree, lesbians and women in general are part of that. And I feel always that we all win when these stories are told and when we can see the world through somebody else's eyes. And apart from that, so I've always, I was part of a group of people like 30 years ago that started a gay and lesbian film festival in Hamburg, my hometown in Germany. We're still all good friends, and the group from the beginning was actually men and women, actually more lesbian women than gay men. But I think also there's just something about Sally's story, especially nowadays, where we're in these times where nobody seems to be talking to each other anymore, where with Sally, as Deborah was just saying, the fact that she was friends with a staunch Republican, this little anecdote about her saying that if she could, talk to Briggs or like reach out to Briggs, like what she would want to do, and people were thinking that she said was going to punch him in the face, and instead Sally said, I would go up to him and give him a big kiss on the lips. I think that's the kind of stories and the kind of people that we need and that we don't have enough of. And I think that's one reason that I was really, really, and still am, really inspired by her story.
Mm-hmm. Melanie?
In thinking about Sally, I think I would like to sort of divide my thoughts into three. I think noting that she was a person of her time who had to sort of be there and perform according to the time, but in her ability to be courageous and as an activist, but she was definitely a person of her time. Then she has her place in history, and look at it from that perspective. And thirdly, and to me, extremely important, is her place in the future. And so it's because of who she was at her time, and it's because of her place in history that we can see how she provides the roadmap for the future. And I think it was Gwen Craig who pointed this out on a YouTube video that I watched, where she was referring to the film Milk that won an Academy Award by Justin Lance Black for his screenplay. Sally was erased from the Briggs Initiative history in that film, where Sally played an integral part. And that erasure does not serve history. And so Deborah and the film team's film is so important to re-establish Sally's place and to stand on the record. And us in this moment in time going forward have an absolute duty to speak about an first ever gay person winning an Academy Award for a screenplay that was misleading is absolutely an outrage to the memory of Sally Miller Gearhart. And one more thing that I would like to say, rigid constructs, and this is where we place Sally in her time when we speak about her as a separatist, rigid constructs of gender remain couched in our own versions of feminism. And we must understand our history, not only to deconstruct the patriarchy or decolonize our bodies as women, but to embrace new movements which challenge our own rigid constructs. So it's so important for us to understand Sally where she was then, to know her contribution and what she did for us in truth and not to mislead, and then to just start the conversation now so that the young people can move forward.
Beautiful, beautiful. Ondine.
Yeah, I could not agree more with that third point that you made. So I'll just tell it mine from a little bit of a more personal perspective. I got the news from Deborah that Sally had died, and we knew that she was going for a while. So I was very surprised when it hit me very, very hard, and I found myself just sort of sobbing uncontrollably, which didn't really make any sense because I'd only met her twice, and I tried to think, tried to figure out, why is this death, other than the obvious reasons, but why is it affecting me so personally? And I think it was, in a way, it was grief for having spent so much of my life without knowing about Sally. So of course, I only found out about her a few years ago when we started working on this project. But I grew up in the backlash against feminism. I grew up, I had very, very lonely experience where, we were all sort of told that feminism, the little short burst of the second wave feminism had fixed everything. And now we could just go forth and conquer. And that didn't turn out to be exactly true. And so it's been and also in my personal life, dealing with all kinds of, the things that many women have to deal with. So when I encountered Sally, it was almost as if her persona and her presence made me feel safer in the world. And so, yeah, I feel very invested in this film personally, because I would like for other women to be able to grow up with Sally. And again, speaking to what Melanie said, looking at what they did versus what's happening now, and I really think there's a bit of a wormhole happening where the two are coming together in a really amazing way. But not to throw all of that out and forget about it and pretend like it didn't matter, but to really figure out how it's led to where we are today and what we have to learn going back and looking at what they did. So that's what Sally means to me.
I really, really resonate and feel you, Ondine, on that. And even though someone like myself didn't know Sally personally, I knew, of her work, and obviously I'm a community member who's benefited from her work. Her death was painful in that it came at a time in which we're still talking about women's rights as if we don't have them or we continually have to fight for them. I mean, case in point, Texas. And so it feels painful. It feels like we're losing a safety blanket, like, Ondine had said. And so I'd love for each of you to talk about, just kind of at this time in how critical it is that we continue to share this work in a way in which our younger generations, our future generations who will have to keep fighting for us will truly understand, the importance of her work. So I'll start with Deborah.
Sure, and also just a shout out both to Melanie and Ondine for their comments, and just a follow up on that. One of the women that we interviewed for the Sally film said feminism was just in the 70s, and you see a little clip of it. It was feminism, this feminist burst. It was so wonderful. It really transformed us. We made so many mistakes. And I think that's the lens we want to have on this is really Sally, and Sally sort of spearheaded this collective effort of women and lesbians and queer folks or gay folks, whatever moniker people like, who really did change the world and made mistakes along the way. And so we need to look at that honestly. So Melanie is absolutely correct. pretty much was a travesty that Sally is left out of the Milk film. So one of our objectives is to put her back in her rightful place in history. But it's more than that, because I really do think that all of us and younger people need to learn again. Unfortunately, we fight the battles over and over again. We need to learn from the way that she fought those battles, and those battles were fought, and they were fought with incredible ferocity. I can't remember who else used that word. Incredible passion, 110%, and not with animosity. And that is where that wonderful quote about Briggs comes from, is that's what I would do to him, because we all expect a punch in the face, and so a kiss on the lips is unexpected. Mm-hmm. And it's coming from love, and that's the other thing that Sally always talked about. And it sounds like hippy-dippy and namby-pamby or whatever, but it is true. It is true, and that we destroy each other if we don't try to understand each other, like Sally and Margie Hanley, her Republican friend, were curious about each other. They didn't say, F you, you're a terrible person, you're wrong. They said, why do you think that? And so that ability not to cede ground, because Sally would go to the extremes. She really would. But she was fearless, but to do it in a spirit of generosity and openness. Somehow I feel like there's a message. And by the way, also, and we talk about this a lot in the process of making the films, it doesn't feel to me like Sally's past history and we just need to put that one puzzle piece in there. Mm-hmm. Sally represents herself and a lot of other women who are involved in Briggs and those other battles. But what she was prescient, and a lot of what she talked about is absolutely relevant today, whether it's violence against women, environmental devastation, cruelty to animals. Those were deep, deep concerns of hers. Any kind of violence was a huge concern of hers, and we better be concerned. An article that she wrote that's really fascinating and controversial was the future, if there is one, is female. Mm-hmm. And so you'll see shirts, the future is female, which is all well and good, but she said the future, if there is one. In other words, it's not a guarantee. And we need to fight to make sure we do have some kind of future, and our children, our nieces, or nephews, or whatever do have some kind of future.
Absolutely. I something popped up in my head. I was like, I wonder if she would give Donald Trump a kiss. A man who gave a platform.
That's pushing it.
Yeah,
I would pushing it.
You'd have to bend down a bit.
Would anyone else like to add to the question of, really digging deeper in Erasure, losing some of our icons, our big voices, the work that they've done, where in a time we really need to continue the work.
I would just quickly add that that it's looking at the mistakes, right? But it's also celebrating. So it's celebrating, and the clip we're going to show has that spirit about it. Just remembering everything that was wonderful and funny and sexy and badass, about what they did at that time. And again, Sally, as a spokesperson for a large group of people who were all playing their part. But so in addition to kind of, looking at the mistakes honestly, also just celebrating the joy and the excitement that they of that time period.
If I could add to what Deb had said as well, that sort of generosity of spirit that you speak of with Sally in the context of her disappointments. When I spoke to Sally directly about her erasure in the Milk film, and I asked her the question directly, and she was upset, but at the same time, she never bore a resentment, and she never held onto that in a resentful way. And if anything, expressed the sort of the glass half full aspect of, insofar as it came back to her and her legacy. So she was very loving and generous of spirit in that way, which actually fueled me up as an activist to want to go out there and scream from the rooftops on her behalf as to the disappointment, because she did express the disappointment and the upset, but she was gracious and kind of heart and would never have taken it up herself. And that's another reason why I felt strongly that it's not something that we could keep quiet about, not only for our community, but for her as well. But I just love that about her, that kindness and that constant uplift. And there are lessons in that, Deb, absolutely.
Well, Auntie mentioned it. Yeah, sure, go ahead.
I have a quick statement about erasure, and we've been talking about this as a film team, is that to really address erasure, we need more women filmmakers, more lesbian filmmakers, more filmmakers of color, more funding for all of those folks. And again, I don't think that we have to only tell stories about people like us, but if we don't have people like us telling stories, we won't get the kind of stories that we crave and that we need and that we want and we deserve.
Very well said. Speaking of funding, speaking of films, and we've got a great team of filmmakers here who are telling a wonderful story. Why don't we segue to the other clip that we have of Sally, and we'll talk a little bit about the film, and then we're getting some great questions from our online audience, so thank you. Keep them coming, and we'll get to those questions a little later. But right now, let's get to the...
Do you mind if Ondine sets it up a little bit and gives the context for this scene so it doesn't come completely out of the blue?
Sure.
Yeah, so we just officially started editing about 2 months ago, and the first process usually involves just watching all the footage down. So this is actually the first editing that's officially been done on the film, hot off the presses. It's pretty new. And I started with a section of the film that I felt drawn to work on because I was so excited about the archival materials that we were finding, home movies and experimental films. So in this section, I think we're really kind of discovering the visual style, the style of the film. This will be probably in Act 2, and it will follow Sally's this backstory and the story of her very painful story of coming out you'll see. But that's where this sequence will come into the film. And it's about 5 minutes long. Cool.
Somewhere over the rainbow, way up high, there's a land that I heard of once in a lullaby.
She was leaving the constraints of Texas, and I think she was ready to let that go. But I don't think that Sally had a clear notion of what living in San Francisco would mean.
San Francisco wasn't yet known as the gay city.
San Francisco had been the nicest, sweetest little beautiful city on the western seaboard, and that had been its reputation for over a century. And it was just shaken to its very roots by this whole business of these crazy queers.
Because we're all alone and dissatisfied. Because we're all alone and dissatisfied.
I mean, for heaven's sake, for the first time in my life, I see men and women walking down the street holding hands in the Castro. I meet Harvey Milk in his camera shop.
And I walked up and down the streets and said, "How do you do? My name is Sally Gerhardt, and I'm a lesbian." I was so proud of being a lesbian. I was so proud about being able to talk about it.
She came out. Just many people of her generation were destroyed. She had found her liberation, and she just walked in, and she was there.
There I was in San Francisco, homeland of the great whole lesbian community, and I had the best time.
United we stand, divided we fall. Stick to your own kind if you don't mind. United we stand, divided we fall. Stick to your own kind if you don't mind. Yeah.
One of the things that sadly has really vanished is the extraordinary lesbian culture that existed in San Francisco when I got here in the 70s. There were so many, I think there was at one point as many as a dozen lesbian venues. Women's dance clubs, places where women could play pool.
My mind was being opened, blown, really, you know, with all the new things that were happening that I didn't know anything about until I moved here.
'Cause you don't have to be alone anymore. 'Cause you don't have to be alone anymore. 'Cause you don't have to be alone anymore. You don't have to be alone anymore.
I think I shall never forget walking into the first meeting of what we were then calling Gay Women's Liberation, and there were something like 80 lesbian women sitting around in that room. I had never seen 80 lesbians together before in my life.
You know, the Sally of 6 months later was simply ebullient. She had bought a motorcycle by that time, a 350, and to ride behind Sally on a 350, clutching her while she went up and down the hills was more than, I mean, I wasn't thinking about lesbianism. I wasn't thinking about gay movements. I was thinking about staying alive. But, you know, she had begun to explore the whole environment with her curiosity.
She was a great synthesizer and able to kind of pick up all the currents around her. I think it was incredibly freeing for Sally to go to San Francisco. I think it allowed her to become everything she was able to become.
She's so cool. That is so great. So let's talk a little bit about Sally, the film, and where we are with the film, and how we all who are here today can support the film.
Well, so I'll jump in quickly and then I'll let Ondine and York follow up. So this has been a process, as all films are. You sort of try to not tell your partner, if you have one, exactly how long it's going to take. And then you say, we'll be done soon. So we've been working on it since 2018, but had footage from the previous film. COVID got in the way, obviously. Funding always gets in the way. I'm not a wonderful fundraiser, but we love donations of any size. It's really, really helpful to us. And as we say, it's really a donation to telling our stories and preserving our history. We're very excited about the progress we're making. We were able to kind of come out the gate running after COVID. COVID hung us up. Then we did a good fundraiser and we got a grant from Cal Humanities. So we just dived into production. We did about a dozen interviews over the summer. Ondine has started post. We're still interviewing. We're going to go to Virginia to meet Sally's half-brother. We're going to go to Texas because Sally's life teaching in the closet was in Texas, and Sally grew up in Virginia. It's sort of like the road not traveled. So, and we're just super, it's just a wonderful team where everybody's really supportive and everybody just fits together and wants to make a great film honoring Sally and with the humor and imagination and creativity. And again, the mountain of contradictions. Sally's fun and funny and would crawl around on the floor with grandchildren pretending to be a cat. And then you see her in the Briggs debate and this incredible brilliance and gravitas where it's like you do not want to be on the other side of a debate from her because she will kick your ass. Okay. So we're excited about the progress, and Jorg and Ondine can tell you, and we need, you know, the support any support you can give us too.
I have moved off the grid in order to. We are editing this film on solar, partly not quite chainsawing topless yet, but I might get there. But all of this is to reduce my costs so that I can spend more time, working on this, devote myself more fully to this. So, yeah, we're dying to make this film. For the past few years, it's been weekends, evenings, whatever we could possibly give, and we're in it to win it. So, yes, we really do. Any help you can give goes very far.
Yeah, if I may chime in. So I think we're about, I would say like 80% done with filming. We have a bunch of it. We have about 30 interviews in the can. We have a few more to make. We started with archival research, which is, the research is not that expensive, but getting the footage is going to be. Most of the clips that you saw inside both the trailer and inside the scene Ondine just presented is preliminary. We need to decide at the end of the day which ones do we want, and then the big negotiations around how much are we going to pay for that are going to start. And I think because of the California Humanities Grant and because of a fundraiser we are probably financed through the end of the year to finish production and to continue maybe having a first rough cut by the end of the year. Don't listen, Ondine, I said that. But sometime soon. And then we're just going to have to start again with fundraising. We had a very ambitious budget that we created when we first started this that had money for Ondine and Deborah and I as producers and for Deborah as director, because we basically do stuff every week. And so far, we've only been able to put the money into actually filming interviews and going out there and hiring other people, because filmmaking is still a very expensive endeavor, unfortunately. And we're in this not for the money. We're in this because we really want to make this film and tell stories, tell Sally's story, so that other people like Deborah are not going to end up reading about this woman and having no idea who she was. Mm-hmm. Hopefully our film will change that once and for all.
We had a really interesting conversation earlier today about privilege. Mm. And, we're all in a situation where we're volunteering hours and hours and hours of our time. And we are privileged enough to be able to do that, because I teach and my partner has a decent job, and it shouldn't have to be that way. It shouldn't rely on, happenstance that I happen to meet Sally through this friend and people who are, not rolling in the dough, but privileged enough to be able to take time off from their lives to just volunteer years of their time to do this. So again, let's turn Hollywood upside down. And I don't know
where all those Hollywood people at are all about diversity and inclusion all of a sudden.
Yeah.
But the golden question is, where can people donate?
So I think we have our fiscal sponsor is Center for Independent Documentary. So anybody who donates, it's a tax deductible donation. I think if you just look up Sally Gearhart documentary, it will come up. It's the Center for, it should say Sally Documentary, on the Center for Independent Documentary, and there's a site where people can donate there.
And there's actually there's another clip on that site that we've shown in the past. We didn't want to do that again here, but there's a really cool clip on that site as well that we were not showing tonight. So if you're really interested in it, you can see that additional clip there.
Let's turn to our online audience. We've got some great questions, and whoever feels that they want to answer, feel free to jump in. Was Sally disappointed by the evolution of lesbian rights in the social scene over the past 40 years, or did she think it got better?
All eyes on Melanie.
Yep. Yeah, Melanie, why don't you start?
Yeah. I think that Sally was very appreciative of where the movement was going. As you might recall, San Francisco Pride honored Sally with an award in those much later years. And I'm vaguely remembering her comment when she received that award. She was honored, deeply honored and touched to receive that. And in doing that, she acknowledged the movement and where it had come. She acknowledged marriage equality, and she was, I think, very proud of where things had gone. I think that she did see her part in that, because as that clip showed, she really, when you saw those few people walking down the street with banners, and then you juxtapose that to dykes on bikes, the women on bikes, and then you juxtapose that these several decades later, that did not escape Sally.
I have one little comment, another little bit of a Sally story, actually, because I talked to her very briefly about marriage equality, and she's like, marriage is part of the patriarchy. So I was like, I know you're right.
Yeah.
So, I think there's a push-pull in her of seeing the changes and appreciating the changes. And I think Sally and a lot of other women didn't want so much just acceptance as revolution. And maybe we still need some of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To add to that, that's what's so interesting is that complexity, because marriage equality, the aspect of it that was tangible was the fact that it beat the religious right.
Mm-hmm. Is there a successor to Sally Gerhardt, or someone who you would say is carrying on her vision?
I'm going to say so many people. I think that's what Sally would say. We talk about her, we can talk about her legacy all the time. But what's becoming increasingly clear is that her legacy is walking around everywhere, whether it's all the people that she taught back at San Francisco State, who, Cherie Moraga, or Lonnie, and I'm never going to be able to pronounce her last name. York, you can help me.
Lonnie Ka'ahumanu.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Who've written books that have changed the world, and just people who live their lives differently because they encountered Sally. So in a way, the people who are carrying the torch are everywhere, but that's such an intriguing question. I'm really going to have to think about that in terms of, is there one person who seems like they may have stepped into her shoes? I don't know, Deborah York.
I can't think of somebody, but I do think that, what we're really trying to show in the film is Sally was a figurehead for a whole movement. And in some ways, what we have now is movements that don't necessarily have figureheads as much as they're more grassroots-focused movements. So, but yeah, there's not somebody that leaps to my mind that is a figurehead in the way that Sally really was.
I was going to respond with maybe it's all of us. Maybe. Yeah. How was Sally most effective in communicating? In her writing, in her public speaking, or in small groups?
Ooh, all of the above. Deborah, do you want to speak to that one?
Well, so I never was there in person to see Sally speak in front of a crowd, but you can tell she was an incredible motivator. And by the way, that's why we're so interested in going to Virginia, among other things, is because she grew up in the church. She had that beautiful kind of booming voice, and by the way, she taught. She was in the theater. She taught theater and communication. So, yeah, I think that, sorry, I just lost my train of thought.
All of the above.
All of the above. So, yeah, sorry.
In
one-on-one, definitely very powerful. And in her writing, there were bits, we had her reading from The Wanderground, and there are bits in her writing that just leap out at you. So, for example, she said, she wrote about religion, and she said, I'm looking forward to the death of the church so we can begin to practice the gospel. And that's just one of many, many, many things that she said where her voice was like, I wouldn't say like a blow to the face, but a kind of a wake-up call in a way. Or she said we should reduce men to 10% of the population, and it's like, was she serious? Was she just trying to get people to wake up? Like, you grab people by the lapels and you shake them. And I think it's some of all of those things.
But everyone seems to agree that her activism was communication. that was the great gift that she was given and that she then shared with all of us, was communication in all of its forms.
The other thing is that her good old friend and also a brilliant scholar in her own right, Dorothy Hacker, talked about Sally. One of Sally's overarching concerns, as I had mentioned, was violence against women, violence against the environment. And what Dorothy just simply said is communication is the opposite of violence. Violence is what happens when communication breaks down. And so whatever form that communication is, whether it's one-on-one, Sally talking to Margie Handley, whether it's up in front of a crowd or whether it's in a written form, it just really, it was exceptional in all of those forms. It was very Sally-like. It sounds strange, but there was a very small memorial for Sally where we spread her ashes at her cabin, and I was fortunate to be invited. And somebody who was there read from Sally's will, because Sally's will was a piece of poetry where she said, "This is what I want done with my body. I want it turned into dog food so we could feed the animals. And if that's not possible, please take me in a helicopter and drop me on the Alaskan tundra so I can be a snack for a wild animal." And this sort of incredible humor and compassion and, quirkiness. So how many else of us have something in a will, which is usually this boring prose that doesn't have anything to do with anything, that really reads like a piece of poetry? And at the end of her will, she said, "And if you feel compelled to have some kind of closure ceremony related to me, make sure there is music and dancing."
Was there anything she changed her mind about over time? Anything she thought she might have wanted to do differently later on?
We can't hear you.
Ondine?
Sorry, it's windy here, so I'm trying to spare you all. So sorry. Just so many things. I think that so much of what she was about was questioning, and questioning her own thinking. And I don't think that, according to all the interviews that we've done with people, and interviews with her as well, I think that she continued to do that until the day she died. She changed. I mean, I could just start rattling things off. But she changed her mind about separatism in certain ways, for sure. Bisexuality was a big one. She had a real hard time with that in the beginning, and it was Lonnie who brought her around. But yeah, a lifelong pursuit of the truth, which included looking at anything that she had done and questioning it. What was it that there's a story someone tells about being on an airplane, and Sally says, "The Wanderground's just a piece of and this person said, it's Ruth. Ruth Mahoney says, "Oh, no, why?" And she says, "Because there's no sex in it." And then proceeded to talk about S&M at the top of her lungs for the rest of the flight. Everyone was very quiet.
Anyone else want to add to that before we move on to the next question? All right. Let's see here. What do you feel is the origin of Sally's huge capacity to consistently reach out to people with opposing viewpoints?
I can speak to that. Sally grew up in Virginia, in a conservative town. She grew up in the church. She grew up in a very segregated area. When this woman I mentioned, Dorothy Hacker, met her, Sally, was a big Ayn Rand devotee, teaching at a Christian college. And so I think that aside from having a really open mind and endless curiosity, her openness to other points of view is that she changed herself, but also could have sort of some kind of empathy and ability to connect with people who are different because she had been different.
This is a really good question, especially for those who want to seek more of Sally. Is there a place or a publication to read her collected writings? Are her papers going to be collected somewhere? They are. We have an audience member who knows the answer to this.
Well, I don't know if anybody else wants to speak to that. I don't want to hog the spotlight, but her papers were deposited at the University of Oregon, and we're actually working on Dean is working with a graduate student up there who's helping us explore the archive. So a lot of her archival material up there is up there. Some of her novels, I think, are no longer in print, and hopefully that can be changed at some point. But if people are interested in certain of her works, they can check in with me, and I can try to connect them with people who can get them to particular works that they might be interested in.
Awesome. Last question. Go ahead, Mel.
I remember being at Sally's house when she herself, and that was probably before your film started shooting, was actually had spread every piece of anything she could find out on a bed, on a piece of furniture, on the floor. And she took us on a guided tour of all this memorabilia of hers and stuff that she had managed to pull together. And she viewed it with such great pride. And so she was clearly starting that process of ensuring her legacy, and or rather the way I saw it was the legacy of the movement at that time. And she spent a lot of time putting that stuff together, and glad to see that people are asking these questions and will seek the stuff out and that it's all coming to fruition.
We've got 5 minutes left of our program. It's been so incredible. The last question from our audience member is, what do you think Sally was most proud of as far as her accomplishments? And so if each of you could take a minute or so to answer that, that would be great. We'll start with Jorg.
You know what? I don't think I can really talk to that. I didn't know her enough, but I hope that, for us, that she would appreciate that we're infusing her sense of humor into the film. I hope that the clips you saw show that there's going to be a lot of laughter, a lot of little anecdotes and fun. And I think just from the way she presented herself, that seemed to be one of her secrets, that she had a lot of humor, and she infused a lot of humor even into situations that otherwise could have been easily derailed.
Mel?
It's a very difficult question to answer for me, other than to say from my own experience with her, and my sense of her in that realm was that she was proud of other people. She was proud of people that came and took some form of the mantle moving forward. And I felt that in the interview that we did with her. It's almost like she asked us the questions. She became sort of somewhat of the interviewer on some level. She wanted to know about us and what we were doing. And there was so much proud that I think she did relate it back to herself.
We keep hearing that story from everyone. Just, in fact, of all the things that we keep hearing over and over again, I think that's the one that's been the most prominent, is just how supportive Sally was of other people, how curious, what a good friend. That's interesting that you had that short experience that you had that as well. I think she was. We asked her the question, and for some reason, I can't think of the answer right now. I'm going to look as soon as the program ends. But I do feel that she was especially proud of her writing. But that was maybe her deepest passion, the science fiction writing. But yeah, tough one to answer.
My sense is that Sally was always forward-looking, so I think she was proud of her past accomplishments, and proud of being part of Briggs and proud of being part of the Women's Studies program. But we interviewed one of her oldest friends, Cynthia Secor, who said Sally just moved on, and we were curious about. She actually retired from teaching early. And I was curious about why, because I get the sense she was an incredibly fantastic teacher who had a deep impact on her students. And I think the answer is she wanted to write. And so she really was one of these people who was a constant searcher, not resting on her laurels, but proudest of the next thing that she wanted to do.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. It's been a great afternoon paying tribute to an icon, a giant, an amazing community member, feminist, political activist, educator, teacher, Sally Gearhart. We'll miss Sally, but we're excited that there's a documentary we're working on of Jorg, Deborah, and Ondine, and it's in progress, and we need a little bit of help and support to get it done. And so you could do that by looking up Sally, the documentary, and support the film as much as you can. I want to thank also Mel for joining us for the conversation. And thank you to our audience members who are here today. Thank you to Weatherford BMW for providing us lunch on the rooftop. Thank you to the Commonwealth Club for the platform, for giving us the opportunity to come together to celebrate Sally. Now you all have a great weekend, and be kind to yourself and kind to one another, and do something Sally would do.
But not too dangerous.
For more upcoming programs, head to commonwealthclub.org/MMS. We'll see you next time.